Now this happened a very long time ago. I'm not going to mention when or where though, and I'm submitting this anonymously. I don't want people going back and finding more about it and then lashing out at me or something. I was 13 years old at the time this happened, and my brother was 11. As I mentioned, this was quite a long time ago. I think that nowadays, not a lot of parents would put a 13-year-old in charge of an 11-year-old, but that was not so unusual back then. In fact, I was looking after my little brother all the time, before either of us even hit 10 years old. After a while, of course, always keeping my eye on him, it began to get very annoying. Oftentimes, it interfered when hanging out with my friends, and it was quite a drag when I would try to talk to girls as well. It was all around just a pain in the ass, really. One day, during a really hot summer, our parents decided to drop us both off at the local swimming pool for the day. My dad had to work, and my mom had some errands and stuff to run. Plus, she had to do work as well for the church. It was extremely hot, and there was no way we could afford air conditioning at the time. We only had one old fan in the house and a sprinkler in the yard we could go play in, but the swimming pool seemed to be a much better option. Of course, the pool was very crowded. Lots of families would drop their kids off there during the summertime actually, and of course, even though I knew it already, my mom stressed to me over and over again, keep an eye on your brother at all times. Some of my friends were there at the pool as well. I got to talking to them and they told me about this new girl who'd moved into town. She would be starting school that fall, and apparently she was really hot. So of course, like any young boy, I wanted to check her out. I knew the lifeguards would be watching my brother in the water anyway, so surely everything would be fine. I went with the guys, and the girl was really cute. My buddies all dared me to approach her, which admittedly was a brave thing for a 13-year-old boy to do. Of course, I couldn't just chicken out in front of them, so I did just that. She was a very sweet girl, actually. We ended up talking for quite a while. Her parents were at the pool with her, and eventually they called her back to join them. I went back to the water to see how my little brother was faring. Only problem was that now I couldn't find him anywhere. This was a small town in a rural area, so although I said the pool was crowded, that's a relative term. It wasn't like busy water park crowded or anything like that. I should have been easily able to pick him out of the water. But no matter where I looked, he just didn't seem to be there. I frantically searched around the area surrounding the pool and couldn't find him there either. My heart started beating faster, and I began to panic. I rushed to the building where the showers and concession stand were. He wasn't there either. You couldn't leave the pool without going through that building. I went over to the attendant and asked if an 11-year-old boy had left the pool on his own in the previous hours. He told me no. I then went to the lifeguards and my buddies. I thought perhaps there was a chance I'd simply missed him. It's easy to occasionally miss someone in a crowd, especially if you're freaking out. The lifeguards ordered everyone out of the pool. Fortunately, there were no drowned children at the bottom or anything, but unfortunately, my brother was still nowhere to be found. The lifeguards had to call my mother at the church. I had never before lost track of my brother like this before. I had no idea what to expect when she showed up. I was only thankful that the police were already at the pool, or she probably would have whipped my ass right there in front of everyone. The trouble I got into at home is not something I want to go into very much. My butt has PTSD from the experience, but that was minor compared to the fear I felt for my little brother. Hell, I didn't even have time to feel guilty, although I knew that I was. My only concern was for him. And what the hell had happened? All day and all night, I expected the police to bring him home, but that didn't happen. I waited the next day too, and it still didn't happen. The town organized a search to look for him. I kept expecting to hear from them that they had found him, but that didn't happen either. After about a week of him not being found, I began to fear the worst. I thought to myself that he must be dead. I was terrified every waking moment, expecting to hear the news that his dead body had just been found. Nearly 2 weeks after the initial disappearance, we got a call from the police. They had found my brother. and thankfully he was alive. Unfortunately, that's not the entire story. Remember the attendant telling me that no boy had left on his own? Well, that's because he had left with one of the lifeguards who was getting off duty. He lured my brother out of the pool and into his car with promises of ice cream, a treat he rarely ever got. He then abducted my brother to his house with him. For all that time, he kept my little brother locked in his basement. He didn't do anything sexually to him, but there was a lot of mental and physical torment when my brother wouldn't do what he was told to do. The scariest part for him was thinking that he would never get out and see any of us again. Here's the weirdest part though. The lifeguard that took him was not an adult. He did this while his parents were out of town for a few weeks. They came back early and caught him with my brother in the basement. If you think I felt bad for my parents punishing me, what they did to him had to be legendary. The police thought he was either planning on killing or releasing my brother before his parents got home, but because they arrived early, no one ever found out for sure. My brother had to live with it without much help for a long time. Mental health assistance had a very bad stigma back then. Luckily, we're both still alive today, and he forgave me for my negligence a long time ago. A few weeks ago, I went outside at around 3 a.m. to move the garbage to the curb. The pickup would be coming later that morning, and I often did this chore in the middle of the night. I tend to keep weird hours, and as the weather warms up for the summer, I find the warm nights preferable to the sweltering days. I was not worried about bothering my neighbors too much, since I didn't use noisy bins, and all the houses directly next to me were currently empty. Actually, I found the quiet of the neighborhood at night to be very relaxing. Unfortunately, since I don't use bins, animals are able to get into the bags a bit easier. While this doesn't happen often, it had happened on this night. I was outside picking up the strewn about garbage and putting it into another bag when the silence of the night was suddenly broken by multiple police sirens. At first, they seemed very distant, and while they startled me, it was not at all unheard of for sirens to sound at night here. Usually though, it would be quite a distance away. As I listened, still bagging the garbage, I could tell multiple sirens were getting closer to my location. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped again. All there was silence. By the time they'd stopped, it sounded like they were 4 or so blocks away. The silence was very intense. I began to haul the bags back to the curb when the neighborhood dogs all started barking at once. It was like every dog in the neighborhood had suddenly got the cue to start barking. Many were even howling like crazy. It continued for a minute or so. Once again, it stopped just as suddenly as it had started in the first place. I hadn't realized at first that I hadn't heard any barking or howling while the sirens were going. Normally, that's how it would work. They would start at the same time, but these dogs had started up separately from the sirens and stopped all at once. That was not normal. I went back to the side of the house to grab some more bags when the silence was broken for a third time. A single chime in the night, like someone getting a phone notification. This time, the sound was not blocks away. The sound was right there, right next to me, no more than a foot away. As I said, the area directly around me was supposed to be empty. I was done. The rest of the garbage could wait until morning. I didn't see anyone in the darkness, but that just made it even worse. That meant there was someone nearby in hiding that I couldn't see. I immediately rushed back into the house and left the garbage for the morning. I don't know how these things were related, if the cops had been chasing someone who was fleeing and that caused the dogs to bark after, or if someone was playing sounds on their phone as they approached my house. Maybe it was all just a coincidence, but I don't think I'll be taking out the garbage at 3 a.m. anymore. For the last few days, I've been reading about various run-ins with creepers, stalkers, and other downright freaky people. Now that I've gotten all good and inspired, I figured I'd add my own story to the list. This started about 5 years ago. My family, consisting of myself, my brother Alec, and of course my mother, were moving around quite a lot at this time. My mom was having a hard time finding a full-time job that paid well. On several occasions, we'd been forced to move out in the middle of the night even. This would all change when she got a job at a well-known lock manufacturer, just a city over. The company even provided her the money to rent a house near the factory, and things were starting to look up for sure. The move proved to be pretty unremarkable, as was our first few weeks in this new place. Despite not really being anything special, it was almost paradise to us kids. The neighborhood was a regular working-class area, loaded with other kids and plenty of things to keep us busy. Ever since our father had passed away when I was about 10, life had been pretty touch and go. Now, it's almost like things used to be, at least for a while. During this time, we did all our usual stuff. Mom worked as much as possible, Alec and I attended school, and then we started to hear the noises. I was the very last to notice them actually. I think Alec had mentioned them to me at one point, but I initially wrote them off as nothing. My mom hadn't bothered to say anything about it for a few days either. I assume she didn't think much of it either. One morning at breakfast though, we all heard it together. This one resembled a ringing chime on a phone or something. It only happened twice that morning, one after another. All three of us began to compare notes on what we'd heard, and we were relieved to know we weren't the only persons hearing these things. We agreed that it might be some sort of bird outside or something. This was not the only sound we'd been noticing. But for this day at least, we put it out of our minds and began to discuss the more important goings-on in our lives. Nothing else of note would occur on that day, but the idea itself had been brought up. We'd all be far more tuned in and wouldn't hesitate to mention anything new in the future. For the next few weeks, every now and then one of us would hear a bump on the floor or a scratching sound or something. We'd make a mental note of it and go on with what we were doing. On weekend mornings when we were all together, we'd mention the week's odd experiences. We even searched the house multiple times over. At one point, we discovered a small hole leading into the attic. We figured a little critter was going in and out and making some of the sounds. There were still a few noises though that would have been impossible for a small animal to make. We thought we may have our answer finally, but some lingering doubts still remained. The real trouble started though when the food began to disappear. This part of the story affected me specifically. For as long as I can remember, I've had a problem with my weight. I've learned to combat it in the years since, but my childhood was made very difficult because of this. This was made even worse by my mom. She'd always been very thin and beautiful, and I couldn't understand why I was not. When the food began to disappear from the kitchen, she of course always blamed it on me. This incident, in addition to a few others, damaged my relationship with my mom so badly that her and I still don't speak often. I'd estimate we'd been living in this house for around 5 months now. Mom and I were now barely speaking, and the noises were still an ongoing problem. We'd all decided since that the house must be haunted. After all, almost a month after covering the hole in the attic and another we discovered leading into the basement, the sounds still continued. What had once simply been a strange issue had now become very frustrating. It added to all of our own issues. Alec himself had been having breathing problems akin to some chronic bronchitis. He just started his freshman year of high school and was playing in the school band as well. On this particular week, he'd been doing well enough with his symptoms to go on a trip out of town. Unfortunately, soon after arriving, his symptoms blew back up and he was sent home for treatment. He arrived back home in the middle of the day when my mom and I were not around. Things were quiet at first, but soon he heard noises coming from the front bathroom. He called out, but no one answered. Not really knowing what was going on, he walked over to the door and opened it. To his complete horror, a man he didn't know was standing half-dressed inside, staring at him. The man moved towards him. Believing he was going to be attacked, my brother fled from the house and ran to a neighbor's for help. This is where he stayed until the cops completed their search. What they discovered would destroy our newfound sense of peace and cause long-term damage. When I arrived home, my mom was still speaking with the police. My confusion quickly gave way to terror after hearing their story. As they cleared the home, nothing appeared out of the ordinary at first. That was until they searched the basement. There, they discovered a makeshift bedroll hidden under the stairs, behind a large stack of boxes. Although the intruder was gone, from what they found, it looked like he'd been sleeping there for quite some time. I felt like I'd been kicked in the stomach, and I became slightly hysterical for a moment. Once I got myself composed, I asked about Alec. He was still across the street and refused to return home. His hands were shaking, sweat was pouring down his face. A few hours passed by, and the authorities had all they needed for the time being. We all returned to the house in a vain attempt to move on, but the side effects began to show themselves almost immediately. Alec was eventually convinced to return, but he was never the same. Nightmares became a nightly occurrence. He was unable to sleep until my mom and I showed him the basement was empty. His breathing troubles grew worse by the day, and I too was very affected. Every minute inside that house made my skin crawl. As for my mom, she didn't say anything, but her sleep too had obviously been hindered. With no news of an arrest, we were all drowning in fear. We did all we could think of to comfort each other, but it didn't really do any good. At the end of the 7th month, we moved into a new place. This was a 3-bedroom condo without an attic or a basement. I remained there for another 2 years before getting a place of my own, where I've been ever since. After moving away from that house, it seems all our lives improved greatly. I'm fit, happy, and in a loving relationship. My mom found love with a gentleman from work and they married a year ago. Alan's breathing problems slowly disappeared after the move. Doctors discovered his problems were likely related to massive amounts of black mold we'd been inhaling. After the diagnosis was made, the health department contacted the landlord, only to discover the house had been demolished soon after we left. I saw this as an admission of guilt. The intruder is still on the loose, of course. As far as I know, he was never identified. Probably we'll never know the full story. He could have gotten in through an unlocked door or a loose window. At that point, he could have even had a key made for the back door. Our big ring of keys that hung on a hook next to the kitchen wouldn't be hard to find. From then on, he'd have free reign over the house whenever he wanted. He'd more than likely been listening in to all our plans from his cubby in the basement, and that idea still gives me shivers. He was content in knowing when he could come and go safely without fear of ever being caught. That was until Alec arrived home unexpectedly. I suppose it's no longer important that he was caught, though. What's important is that we've all moved past the experience, and any long-term effects have dwindled in time. One small thing does arise, however. I wonder if our intruder has moved on to another basement. It's a part of the home most of us spend little to no time in. Perhaps you reading this are one of those people. Can you be so sure no one is lurking in the areas you never check, listening to your every word and movement? Maybe you should go check for once, just to be sure. Alright, so this happened when I was about 11 years old. I'm a girl, by the way. I had a friend who was 12, also a girl, over at my dad's house for the first time, and we were having quite a lot of fun together. My dad went out into the front yard to take a phone call at some point. At this time, it was about 10:30 or so at night. We were both hyped up off Dr. Pepper and Mountain Dew, and we were so hyper we decided to follow my dad outside. We mainly stayed in the front yard until we decided we wanted to go back inside. Me and my friend jumped the back fence because we were right next to it. For some context, I had a pit bull and a large German shepherd who shared the backyard. My friend and I went up to the second floor and were playing with some makeup. About 30 minutes later, we went back downstairs. I could hear my dogs barking and crying like crazy. I decided to let them in the house. The dogs had their own fenced-off area in the backyard in order to not interfere with the garden. My dad hadn't let them back in for the night yet. My friend pointed out that my dad was still on the front porch. I went to the back door to open it, only to jump in surprise when I saw a man crouching by the back gate, staring at my back door. He was next to the side of the gate we had previously jumped over. I asked my friend to stay there and make sure that the man stayed in place. I was going to go check if my dad was still outside. Sure enough, there he was, still on the phone. For whatever reason, I didn't tell my dad this man was in our backyard. Instead, me and my friend watched him out there in terror for about 20 minutes. After those 20 minutes, he moved across the street and crouched behind a car for another 5, then came back to the gate. I decided it was unsafe for my dogs to still be back in the yard, so I turned on the light to help me see clearer and let the dog's gate open. After I let my dogs in, the guy was still crouched and not moving a single bit. After 10 more minutes, which to me seemed like 10 hours, passed by, the man was still there. He stood up suddenly. After seeing him standing, I realized he was holding something, which seemed to be some sort of metal pipe or perhaps a bat. I locked the door, and my friend and I ran across the house to the front door to tell my dad to come back inside. I never did give him an explanation as to why, but I'm guessing he saw the urgency in my face or voice and listened. After that, we didn't see the man again.